All right. So our fourth objective is to describe the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormones and distinguish between direct and permissive actions of thyroid hormones. So we're really going to get into the specifics of some of these glands. The thyroid is one of them, the adrenals is one of them, that we'll really kind of focus in on, including the pancreas as well. The gonads we will not speak about here. We'll talk about the gonads and look at the reproductive system, which comes up in AMP2. And then the kidneys and their role we'll talk about as well later on. So some of those glands we mentioned, both primary and secondary, we won't really get into, but some thyroid, pancreas, and adrenals, we will. So let's begin with the thyroid gland. Again, it's found in the neck. It's anterior to the trachea. It has two large lobes, which have two poles each, superior and inferior. It is going to make two types of hormones, T3 and T4. T4 is tetraiodothyronine, which is thyroxine, and T3 is triiodothyronine. And the main function of T3, T4 is to regulate our metabolism. And so I'm going to give you sort of an example of what this regulation with thyroid hormone looks like in order to really understand its function. So think about Graves' disease. Think about hyperthyroidism. These patients typically have a hyperactive metabolism. They have frequent sweating, frequent urination. They have increased body temperature or increased heat production from the body. They have increased just movement, sometimes spasms. They have an increased rate of appetite, just overall increased in all areas of their metabolism. They're usually very slim. They lose weight very easily because of this overall increase in metabolism. On the flip side, hypothyroidism, patients that have hypothyroidism are usually overweight because, again, very slowed metabolism. They usually have a decreased menstrual cycle, menstrual functioning, because one of the first things that goes away when our bodies, is having a difficult time with energy production, energy consumption, is the menstrual cycle. So they usually have decreased menstrual cycle, decreased energy, difficulty losing weight, loss of hair, and things of that nature. So when we look at those two clinical pictures, we can kind of get a sense of what the function of thyroid hormone is. Another hormone released from the thyroid gland is calcitonin. Calcitonin is made from the parafollicular cells. So there are two types of cells found in the thyroid gland, and the calcitonin are in between the follicles, making calcitonin. And the function of calcitonin is to decrease blood calcium levels, right? In terms of entering that into the bone, as opposed to increasing the blood calcium levels. So thyroid hormone is made by the thyroid follicle. If you were to look inside a thyroid gland, you'd see these different repeating units called follicles that are lined by follicular cells. Inside of that, we would find colloid. This yellow staining region here is called colloid, and colloid is really the precursor or the stored form of thyroid hormone, and that is called thyroglobulin. It's a protein substance called thyroglobulin, which is used to make the thyroid hormone that is released from these follicular cells. So it's really the storage form of thyroid hormone. Now, importantly, in order to utilize this storage, utilize this thyroglobulin and turn it into T3, T4, we need iodide in its ionized form. And in order to do that, we need to have it in the diet, transported in the bloodstream, and then it can be used to make T3, T4, added to thyroglobulin, and that is how we convert thyroglobulin into these thyroid hormones. So we say that to say that iodide is important, iodine in the diet, and then iodized into iodide, and then ionized into iodide, excuse me, and that comes in the diet. And so when we have deficiency of iodine in the diet, that can result in hypothyroidism as well, decreased thyroid hormones, because we don't have adequate amounts in order to make that thyroglobulin into functional thyroid hormone. Okay. So looking more closely at the mechanism of how this is converted. So here is thyroglobulin. And then here are these iodide residues, and they are added to thyroglobulin in order to make T3, T4. If we have DIT, which is two iodide residues, then we make T4, right? Two DIT makes T4. If we have one DIT and one MIT, M meaning mono, D meaning di, then we're going to have two residues plus one residue, and that makes T3. So depending on how we combine these iodine residues with thyroglobulin will determine whether we make T3 or T4, right? Tetraiodothyronine or tetraiodo thyroxine, right, which is T4. So that is uptaken into the follicular cells, and that is transported through the cell in these vesicles, and then released into the bloodstream as thyroid hormone. Now, if we look at the precursor steps upstream, in order for this to be uptaken, TSH has to be in the bloodstream. TSH comes from the anterior pituitary, circulates in the bloodstream, binds to TSH receptors here on the thyroid follicle, these follicular cells, and then is going to stimulate through this whole second messenger pathway the uptake of these globs or these vesicles with T3, T4, transport those to the cell, and help them to be released into the bloodstream. So I just want to point out how TSH, being a trophic hormone, is extremely important in terms of the uptake and release of thyroid hormone. Now, again, going back to the functions of thyroid hormone, it's lipophilic, so it functions like steroids. In fact, we need adequate amounts of fat in order to make some of these hormones. It's going to alter the rate of transcription of mRNA, so basically altering the weight of DNA transcription, weight of making of proteins, just overall the weight of production of proteins inside of our cells. If we have inadequate amounts during development, during fetal development, this results in cretinism. This is indicating how crucial thyroid hormone is to fetal development. If in pregnancy, mom does not have adequate amount of iodine in her diet, if she does not make adequate amounts of thyroid hormone, then there can be cognitive deficits with the fetus, there can be developmental deficits, and this is because of the tissues in the developing fetus that are highly metabolic active, the brain, the bones, the muscles. And if they don't have adequate amount of T3, T4, then they will not develop adequately. So again, cognitive deficits, movement deficits because of nerve developmental deficits, as well as just overall functional decline, right? So it's really important to have this during development. Looking at some of the specific metabolic functions of thyroid hormone, this results in the calorigenic effect. So basically increasing the rate of calorie burning, if you will. And this includes the rate of sodium potassium pump. And we know that the sodium potassium pump is important for the action potential, for reestablishing the resting membrane potential. And so we also know that the faster a neuron can reestablish its resting membrane potential, the faster it can transmit a new action potential. So speeding up the rate of the sodium potassium pump indirectly speeds up the rate of action potentials, right? Makes things move faster. Increasing the number and size of mitochondria, which just means more ATP production, more energy production, increasing the oxidative phosphorylation enzyme, same thing. This is where the bulk of ATP is made by cellular respiration. So if we increase the number of enzymes that are acting in oxidative phosphorylation, we're going to increase the amount of ATP produced. Enhances glycogenolysis, proteolysis, and lipolysis. This is the breakdown of these major biomolecules. Breakdown of fats, breakdown of proteins, breakdown of glycogen to make glucose. So if we enhance these catabolic functions, breaking things down, we're going to be liberating more sources of ATP to drive cellular respiration. Promotes gluconeogenesis and ketone synthesis, again, driving more energy production, more energy sources, in order to make more ATP. And then lastly, promotes synthesis of beta-adrenergic receptors. And beta-adrenergic receptors are important in stimulating the heart rate, right? Things like, we talked about this on the lungs, on other smooth muscle found throughout the body, on the kidneys. And so this is also going to result in more of that fight or flight response, right? More of that increased metabolic state, which is a part of the sympathetic nervous system. So all of this to say it's going to increase the rate of and speed up the rate of metabolism in terms of all of our cellular functions and processes. All right, this was just a drawing looking at the thyroid hormone axis and how that has a negative feedback loop. So we look generally at the short loop versus the long loop, and then we can look more specifically here at the short loop and long loop pertaining to thyroid hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. It stimulates the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, right? And I've just put here posterior pituitary. Remember, posterior pituitary is only involving two hormones, only oxytocin and ADH. It has no part to play with the trophic hormones of the anterior pituitary. The TSH then stimulates the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4. Now, the important difference between T3 and T4 is that T3 is more active in tissues like the liver, the kidneys, and more active in bringing about that calorogenic effect that we described earlier, whereas T4 is more active in the feedback loops. So T4 is going to be more active in terms of, bringing the levels up and being a negative feedback signal to the hypothalamus to block the production of TRH. So T3 is kind of on the ground doing the job, and T4 is really monitoring the axis and being a signal to decrease the initial hypothalamic trophic hormone, which is TRH. And again, just reiterating some of the areas where T3 acts, the liver, to increase some of those processes we described earlier, like glycogenolysis, proteolysis, etc. The kidneys similarly, and then most of our other body cells, fat cells, muscle cells as well. If we contrast that to the short loop is the anterior pituitary. And I know the posterior pituitary is on this side, but please don't be confused here. This is indicating the anterior pituitary, which is where TSH is made. And TSH can also have a negative feedback as a short negative feedback loop onto TRH production as well. Okay. And again, I'll share this drawing just so that you can go over this, but I encourage you to practice drawing this out with some of the other axes that we're going to look at, like the cortisol axis, and then even the release from the pancreas as well. Now, we also want to think about the parathyroid hormone and parathyroid glands. Remember, I mentioned that these are embedded in the back of the thyroid gland itself. So looking posteriorly at the neck and pharynx, we can see the back of the gland, and we can see those 4 parathyroid glands embedded into the lobes of the thyroid gland. The function of parathyroid hormone is to regulate the calcium levels in the blood, specifically to increase blood calcium levels. If you recall, we talked about the calcitonin release. Calcitonin was made from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid, and that is often confused with the parathyroid gland, right? But they're different. Parafollicular cells are cells of the thyroid gland that make calcitonin, and calcitonin decreases calcium levels in the blood, whereas parathyroid hormone is made from the parathyroid glands, and parathyroid hormone is going to increase blood calcium levels, which is kind of going to be the opposite or antagonistic hormone of calcitonin.